The ideal of the perfectly peaceful man, the sensitive and conflict-averse soul championed by modern psychology, is not the pinnacle of civilization. It is an evolutionary dead end, a soft target waiting for history to run him over. We have spent the last few decades pathologizing the very chemical mechanism that built the structures we now stand upon, labeling the raw engine of male drive, testosterone, as a poison to be suppressed rather than a power to be contained. This is the great modern paradox. Society demands men be harmless, yet subconsciously punishes them for being useless. The man who cannot conceive of conflict, who lacks the internal wiring necessary for protective aggression, is not virtuous. He is simply incomplete, a relic who has outsourced his primary biological mandate to the state, and that outsourcing always comes with a psychological cost. My thesis is brutally simple. The capacity for controlled aggression is not a moral flaw, but a necessary psychological infrastructure, and the man who has actively eradicated his fighting spirit has traded competence for convenience, rendering himself irrelevant at the critical moment. We confuse impotence with pacifism. We assume the absence of violence in a man equates to elevated morality, but we mistake the meekness born of incapacity for the restraint born of strength. The truly moral man, the guardian, is not the one who cannot throw a punch, the one who can effortlessly dismantle an aggressor and consciously chooses not to, a choice that requires immense character and hormonal firepower. The conflict-avoidant male, however, has never even developed the internal mechanisms to make that choice. He is simply the recipient of events, unable to influence them when the situation escalates beyond polite conversation. If you are tired of the comforting, shallow moralizing that passes for psychological truth today, smash the subscribe button. We deal in the deep reality of human nature here, not comforting myths designed to keep the system running smoothly. The core function of testosterone is not aggression itself. It is the biological lubricant for competence acquisition. Think of it this way. What does the high T state enable? It enables risk calculation, status seeking, the willingness to endure pain for future gain, and the profound, stubborn insistence on competency. These traits are forged in the crucible of psychological and social conflict, long before any physical confrontation takes place. When a man takes a calculated risk in business, when he challenges a flawed idea in a boardroom, when he endures the grueling training required to master a skill, he is accessing that same primal drive system. By encouraging the suppression of the aggressive impulse, the very urge to conquer, to master, to defend, we are fundamentally disabling the engine of masculine drive that compels him to excel in non-violent domains. We are telling men to turn down the furnace, then wondering why the whole house is cold and why they settle for mediocrity. Evolution is an honest accountant. It does not grade on intention, it grades on outcome. For millennia, the man who was incapable of defense, the man who would stand aside while his resources were plundered or his tribe was threatened, was removed from the gene pool, either directly or through reproductive failure. This hard-coded reality still shapes our unconscious judgments. When a woman or society assesses a man's value, they are not primarily looking for docility, they are looking for stability, and stability is inextricably linked to the demonstrable capability for effective response when that stability is threatened. The ultra-pacifist man signals vulnerability, and vulnerability, in the cold calculus of biology, is a massive liability. He becomes, in essence, a parasitic structure, relying entirely on the residual protective scaffolding erected by the men who possess the exact chemical courage he has been told to discard. He enjoys the security guaranteed by the high T men of the past, while simultaneously condemning the very mechanism that provided that security. This is intellectual and psychological hypocrisy, and it is destined to collapse the system from within. The cost of this denial is not merely social, it is neurological. When you suppress a fundamental, high-voltage psychological drive, that energy does not simply evaporate, it metastasizes. The aggression that is denied the high-ground expression of mastery and defense turns inward, manifesting as generalized anxiety, chronic depression, and a suffocating sense of meaninglessness. The man who is forbidden to say a resonant, powerful no to the world, a protective boundary, a strategic withdrawal, an outright challenge, finds that he eventually loses the capacity to say an authentic yes to anything important. His internal landscape becomes fragmented. He appears passive and agreeable on the surface, but underneath, the denied drive system is engaged in a low-grade civil war. consuming his vitality and expressing itself through passive aggression, cynicism, and an exquisitely sensitive, victim-oriented resentment. This internal split is the definition of neurosis, a condition we have now effectively industrialized, confusing political quietude with psychological health. This profound truth about the necessity of channeled aggression is perhaps the most dangerous idea currently available, precisely because it threatens the modern administrative safety structure. If you want to understand the true hidden cost of psychological denial and ensure you don't miss the upcoming analysis of how this fragmentation infects modern relationships, hit that subscribe button right now. Do not mistake the man who avoids conflict for the man who has achieved peace. The ultra-pacifist often carries within him an incredible potential for delayed structural violence, where he doesn't assault the threat directly, but rather allows his environment, his family, or his finances to slowly disintegrate through calculated inaction and strategic weakness. His lack of engagement is itself an act of quiet destruction, a refusal to bear the burden of competency, which is the ultimate form of betrayal in an interdependent system. The suffering we observe, the epidemic of anxiety, the pervasive feeling of existential drift, is the direct consequence of living in a society that attempts to eliminate productive conflict while simultaneously demanding peak performance. We have traded the psychological reward of confronting a genuine threat for the cheap, temporary relief of avoiding it entirely. Yet, the human nervous system is wired not for comfort, but for challenge. To feel psychologically sound, we require the feedback loop of productive friction, identifying a high-stakes problem, marshaling internal resources, engaging with the difficulty, enduring the pain, and achieving a measurable, hard-won outcome. When that process is obstructed, when the only sanctioned form of engagement is the sterile process of bureaucratic compliance, the psyche begins to starve. The drive to master is replaced by the desperate compulsion to consume, and the urge to confront is replaced by the endless, meaningless scroll of social media, where men desperately seek simulated mastery through the performance of curated opinions or the accumulation of digital stat markers. They are perpetually stuck in the preparation phase, unable to pull the trigger on actualization, mistaking information intake for competence. This suppressed, pressurized energy has to vent, and it typically does so through displacement. The energy of aggression, denied its high-stakes, real-world target, mastery, creation, defense, finds a low-cost substitute in moralistic fervor. The man who is too afraid to challenge his boss, or his own financial stagnation, or the structural inertia of his life, becomes fiercely, performatively judgmental of abstract enemies or minor social infractions. This explosion of performative digital outrage, the relentless, self-righteous policing of minor thoughts and secondary issues, is merely aggression diluted into sanctimony. The psychological equation is chillingly simple. I cannot defend myself against the genuine existential threats, mortality, financial failure, incompetence. So I will channel my defensive energy into condemning the misspellings or political deviation of a stranger online. It is low-cost moral theater, substituting the courage of action with the cheap dopamine hit of communal outrage. This isn't strength. It is the frantic thrashing of a drive system that has been neurologically caged and is now attempting to chew its way out through the easiest available exit, which is always the path of least personal risk. The moral crusader is often just a coward in disguise, weaponizing judgment because actual confrontation requires risk. The irony is that this cultural project, designed to maximize safety and empathy, inevitably produces a brittle, resentful population incapable of genuine empathy, because they lack the self-possession required to stand outside their own internal turmoil. True compassion, the capacity to endure the suffering of another without being overwhelmed, requires an aggressive psychological boundary, a deep self-trust in one's capacity to remain stable despite external chaos. The man who lacks the capability for defense is perpetually on edge, projecting his own fear onto the world. He views others not as complex, flawed entities, but as potential sources of pain or contamination that must be managed, censored, or eliminated. His world shrinks to the size of his perceived vulnerability, and he seeks refuge in tribal conformity, demanding that the world accommodate his fragility rather than building the internal fortitude necessary to accommodate the world. This is the ultimate cost of disabling the engine of drive. We create individuals who are exquisitely sensitive to offense and tragically inept at resilience. The mechanism is this. The defensive energy, having been denied its natural outlets, competition, ambition, disciplined risk, is repurposed internally, turning the individual into a self-appointed auditor of reality, where the primary objective is to eliminate all cognitive dissonance. This explains the grotesque spectacle of modern intellectual life, where data is no longer processed for truth, but filtered for emotional safety. We see it play out in the halls of institutions supposedly dedicated to truth, where the internal engine of drive is so crippled that the introduction of a contradictory idea, a piece of data that complicates the narrative, a historical fact that disrupts the moral clarity of the present moment, is met not with curiosity, but with a visceral, somatic panic. The idea is no longer a tool for understanding. It is categorized as a pollutant, a contaminant that must be immediately purged. This is the real-world manifestation of psychological regression, the adult mind reacting to ambiguity as if it were a predator. Consider the recent and brutal reality of the cancellation cycle. A professor publishes a study on complex human behavioral differences, or a speaker is invited to discuss a geopolitical situation that lacks easy heroes and villains. The response is rarely scholarly debate. Instead, the emotional fragility of the audience immediately translates intellectual friction into physical injury, demanding the person presenting the challenging information be fired, silenced, or exiled. This is the moral cowardice of the collective given executive power. They are not defending truth. They are defending their own constructed reality, which is defined entirely by the exclusion of anything that might force them to feel the difficult friction of cognitive effort. The internal drive, which should have been trained to aggressively pursue understanding even through pain, has been entirely disabled, leaving behind only a hypersensitive nerve ending disguised as a righteous political position. The cost of engaging with this brutal truth is high, and the easy path is always to ignore the underlying mechanics and just argue about the superficial politics. If you value this kind of unfiltered analysis, the kind that cuts through the noise and targets the mechanism of psychological collapse, then consider subscribing now. It is the only way this kind of deep, unpopular work can continue to exist. What we are witnessing is a catastrophic category error, the aggressive confusion of feeling offended with actually being harmed. And the profound tragedy is that the individuals demanding this sanitized reality are actively preventing their own psychological maturation. Resilience is not the absence of stress. It is the repeated and successful negotiation of stress. By demanding that the external world guarantee their internal stability, they are permanently locking themselves into a state of perpetual psychological infancy. They mistake their emotional volatility for moral sensitivity, when in reality it's simply the sound of a human spirit refusing the necessary painful friction of growth. They do not want complexity. They want quiet conformity, because conformity is the only condition under which their fragile internal system can maintain its precarious balance. This is the inverted totalitarianism of the modern era, the tyranny of the sensitive, achieved not through tanks and prisons, but through the weaponization of manufactured vulnerability. And this is where we run directly into the most popular and destructive psychological lie of our generation, the aggressive and entirely fabricated dogma that vulnerability is strength. This is not just misleading. It is a foundational error that corrupts the internal incentive structure of the modern psyche. We are told relentlessly that the display of immediate, unmanaged emotional distress is an act of profound courage, when in practice, it is usually a demand for immunity. True strength, historically, was defined by the capacity to absorb suffering, process it in silence, and convert that painful friction into wisdom or disciplined action. It was internal, unbroadcasted, and fiercely private. The modern definition, however, demands the exact opposite. Strength is now defined by the speed and eloquence with which you can externalize your pain, turning your private struggle into a public performance designed to solicit validation and acquire moral leverage over those around you. We have transitioned from the Stoic ideal that you control your response to the world to the exhibitionist ideal that the world must control its behavior to accommodate your sensitivities. The transaction is perverse. The more fragile you prove yourself to be, the higher your social value rises, because fragility becomes a currency of moral untouchability. The system actively rewards performative suffering, creating a profound disincentive for actual psychological repair. Why solve your problem internally when broadcasting your wound guarantees social reward sympathy capital, and executive power over the narrative. This entire framework is a psychological and sociological parasite, feeding on the unearned moral authority granted to manufactured weakness. It is a reversal of evolution itself, where the fittest are not those who adapt, but those who successfully demand the environment adapt to them. If you find this dissection of modern psychological mechanisms useful, if you believe it is crucial to analyze the deep structure of societal decay rather than just arguing about the resulting political noise, then please consider subscribing to support this channel. It is only through the shared effort of a dedicated audience that this uncompromising level of analysis can be maintained, pushing back against the inertia of superficial thought. We must recognize the fundamental corruption. The celebration of vulnerability is often just the aggressive marketing of a self-imposed limitation, wrapped in the protective camouflage of righteousness. It forces a zero-sum game of emotional dependency, where self-sufficiency is redefined as a form of callous aggression. Anyone who successfully manages their own pain, anyone who refuses to participate in the economy of trauma, is seen as a threat because their existence proves that the demand for guaranteed comfort is negotiable. They reveal the core deception, which is that pain is not a catastrophe, but the raw material for character. This inverted morality punishes internalization and forces everyone into a compulsory display of psychological submission, proving their loyalty to the collective fragility. They are constructing a society defined not by what it can endure, but by what it must perpetually avoid. This manufactured avoidance becomes the primary cultural output, a vast, complex machine dedicated solely to buffering citizens from the necessary difficulty of existence, ensuring that the human soul remains perpetually soft, eternally uncalloused, and therefore infinitely controllable. The tragedy compounds when the generation raised under this regime begins to mistake their lack of mental toughness for sophisticated insight. They mistake their panic for wisdom. They mistake their refusal to engage with uncomfortable ideas for intellectual purity. They have been systematically robbed of their capacity for internal resilience. They suffer not merely because the world is hard, but because they have been taught that the function of civilization is to eliminate all forms of psychological friction, mistaking the absence of struggle for the presence of health. When the external buffers inevitably fail, when the guarantee of comfort is broken by the brute reality of entropy, betrayal, or failure, they don't experience a setback. They experience an existential catastrophe because they have outsourced their internal locus of control entirely. Their psychological architecture is built on sand, ready to collapse into learned helplessness the moment a strong wind blows. The greatest irony is that the human mind, deprived of real, necessary challenges, of enemies worth fighting, of pain worth enduring, will inevitably generate its own neurosis to fill the void. A life buffered entirely from difficulty is not a peaceful life. It is a mind starved of the very resistance required to sharpen its edge. They mistake the dull hum of their own self-generated anxiety for a profound societal sickness, unable to grasp that they are manufacturing their own trauma in the absence of the real kind, simply because the brain is a problem-solving machine that requires problems to function. And this is the fundamental sickness. When true pain is rejected as an anomaly, manufactured pain becomes a badge of authenticity, leading to the aggressive performance of fragility, where suffering is not something to be overcome, but a commodity to be traded for power and attention. If you are finding this line of analysis valuable, if you appreciate the effort to dissect the profound structural rot beneath the surface-level debates, then I would ask you to take a moment and subscribe. This channel is dedicated to the uncompromising pursuit of psychological clarity, and it requires the support of an audience that values depth over comfort to continue resisting the tides of intellectual softness. We must understand that the modern emphasis on emotional purity has weaponized morality, turning ethical principles into tools for managing personal discomfort. The new definition of evil is simply anything that causes me, the sensitive viewer, the slightest degree of existential discomfort. This is not a philosophy. It is a tantrum formalized into a cultural operating system. It results in a constant low-grade moral panic, a pervasive state of intellectual and emotional censorship, where the avoidance of offense is prioritized above the pursuit of truth, and where robust disagreement is rebranded as violence. They have conflated intellectual engagement with psychic injury, ensuring that any idea that demands effort, responsibility, or self-criticism is dismissed not as incorrect but as toxic. This is how a culture effectively commits intellectual suicide, by systematically eliminating every challenging force that might have strengthened it, mistaking the sterile quiet of the mausoleum for the tranquil peace of a garden. They are cultivating a generation that believes the purpose of dialogue is not discovery, but agreement, and the purpose of life is not mastery, but safety. That search for safety, when fully formalized, demands the eradication of psychological friction. This is the great operational pathology of our time, because psychological friction, the rub, the scrape, the intellectual discomfort of encountering a hostile or difficult truth, is not a regrettable side effect of learning. It is the engine of growth itself. We've created a society that pathologizes the very stimulus required for the development of emotional tensile strength. Look at the administrative architecture built to enforce this fragility. The brutal, undeniable proof that we have chosen performance over potency resides in the widespread institutionalization of mental buffers, trigger warnings, safe spaces, and the systematic policing of literary and historical curricula. Consider the absurd theater of academia, where students now demand administrative protection from dead authors. When a student demands a trigger warning before encountering Sophocles, or a historical text describing genocide, they are not engaged in an act of sophisticated ethical analysis. They are attempting to negotiate the terms of reality. They are performing a boundary violation on the cosmos, insisting that the dark, difficult, often terrifying complexity of human existence must first be filtered and sanitized to meet the specifications of their current emotional tolerance. When the institution complies, when the university administration validates the demand to be protected from a difficult idea or a historical horror, it commits an act of profound intellectual cowardice. It teaches the student a devastating lie, that their subjective emotional state holds higher epistemological authority than objective truth or historical fact. The goal of education ceases to be the challenging of assumptions and becomes the confirmation of current bias, resulting in a generation perfectly insulated from minor discomforts but structurally incapable of facing genuine existential catastrophe. They have confused the concept of psychological resilience with the state of perpetual comfort, guaranteeing that the first real storm that hits them will shatter them completely. This engineered vulnerability is why the performance of suffering has become so lucrative. If you can successfully demonstrate that a given set of words, a historical image, or a necessary disagreement has caused you genuine psychic injury, you are immediately elevated to a position of moral untouchability, armed with the power to demand the censure and exclusion of the alleged aggressor. The manufactured wound becomes the weapon, turning the entire concept of empathy into a transactional currency. It is a stunning display of administrative and intellectual submission, and if you are still here, listening to this difficult dissection of what most people would rather ignore, then I know you value the commitment to deep analysis over easy comfort. The support of people who seek this kind of clarity is the only thing that allows this work to resist the tides of superficiality that dominate the current cultural conversation. Please subscribe and help support content that is willing to speak the unpopular truths necessary for real psychological development. This pervasive focus on emotional hygiene has created a secondary, more insidious market, the market for perpetual forgiveness, where maturity is defined not by the acceptance of responsibility, but by the skillful externalization of blame. The pervasive focus on emotional hygiene has created a secondary, more insidious market, the market for perpetual forgiveness, where maturity is defined not by the acceptance of responsibility, but by the skillful externalization of blame. This externalization is the philosophical cornerstone of perpetual infancy. If every failure is a systemic injustice and every painful feeling is the fault of an aggressor, then the burden of change never falls upon the self. The individual remains perpetually pure, perpetually wounded, and perpetually entitled to an intervention from a higher authority, be it the university administration, the judicial system, or the cultural collective. We are watching the collective regression of the Western mind, an eager and voluntary return to the womb, demanding a world sterilized of challenge, disagreement, and the inherent friction of existence. This is why the arguments always spiral into absurdity, because the debate is not truly about objective reality. It is about who can most convincingly claim the moral high ground based on the depth of their perceived injury. It is a competition for the status of the unassailable victim, which is simultaneously the status of the weakest, yet most powerful person in the room. The fragile soul, armed with manufactured offense, has become the dominant social tyrant. The final devastating verdict is this: The prioritization of emotional safety over intellectual rigor is not a sign of moral progress. It is the definitive signature of a collapsing civilization. It is the moment a society has decided that the arduous, painful work of freedom is simply too much to bear. The entire enterprise of modern psychological hygiene has produced precisely the opposite of its stated intention. It has not created resilient individuals capable of self-actualization. It has manufactured delicate, hypersensitive dependents, terrified of reality, incapable of true risk, and completely reliant on institutional scaffolding to manage their daily existence. We have not eliminated suffering. We have merely traded the noble suffering of struggle for the basing suffering of stagnation. The lie that you can control the entire world by controlling the words used within it is the final, pathetic refuge of the coward who refuses to control themselves. Look inward. The path to power is not found in seeking validation for your wounds, but in recognizing that the only things worth fearing are the truths you refuse to face. The fundamental reality of human flourishing has always been predicated on the capacity for enduring discomfort, absorbing necessary pain, and refusing the seductive offer of perpetual protection. Do not mistake the craving for comfort for the pursuit of peace. Peace is what you earn after the war. Comfort is what you crave before the battle. The defining challenge of the 21st century is the brutal necessity of choosing painful truth over comfortable delusion, even when the entire world is screaming at you to lie down and claim your wound. Be the one who stands up, who faces the necessary friction, and who refuses to surrender their critical mind for the cheap reassurance of emotional safety. If this relentless commitment to honesty, even when it demands confronting the most difficult societal truths, resonates with you, if you are part of that minority who understands that real psychological strength requires the deliberate acceptance of danger, then you are already part of the community that makes this analysis possible. Join us. Subscribe now and help us build a platform dedicated to the difficult, necessary work of thinking deeply in a world determined to distract itself into oblivion. The most subversive thing you can do today is think clearly. Start here. Start here. The final conclusion, the verdict that history relentlessly delivers to every civilization that chooses weakness over necessity, is this: you cannot outsource your courage. The comfort you demand today will become the currency of your enslavement tomorrow. The promise of zero risk is the highest risk of all, because it systematically destroys the very faculties necessary to survive when the promised scaffolding inevitably collapses. You were not put on this earth to be managed. You were put here to manage yourself. And the only freedom that truly matters is the freedom to fail spectacularly, to stand nakedly accountable for your choices, and to suffer only the consequences that truly belong to you. The delusion of infinite safety is the philosophy of a child. The acceptance of necessary danger is the grim, terrifying joy of the adult mind. This is the ultimate choice laid before every person alive today. Do you wish to be perfectly protected, utterly weak, and forever reliant on a system that profits from your fear? Or do you wish to be dangerously strong, imperfectly free, and beholden only to the reality you have the strength to confront? I will tell you the truth. The suffering that accompanies the pursuit of truth is always lighter than the crushing weight of a comfortable lie. Choose the burden of responsibility. It is the only path to true power. We need to build a space where challenging these fundamental assumptions is the baseline, where intellectual rigor triumphs over emotional fragility, and where the necessary friction of genuine debate is welcomed, not censored. If you are ready to stop demanding external safety and instead cultivate internal strength, then join this intellectual frontier. Subscribe, and help us continue the difficult work of thinking clearly in a world desperate to forget how. The ultimate verdict is that freedom is earned through confrontation, not granted by protection. If you are waiting for permission to be strong, you will wait forever. Choose your strength. Subscribe now and join the community that chooses responsibility